All right, hang on. Let's see here. Okay.
Hopefully you can hear me okay.
I can.
And I think I fixed the lag on my video, so you get nice
Yeah, it looks
lag-free video.
real nice. Okay.
Hopefully I'm in focus.
Yeah, you look great. Fantastic. Okay, here we are. Welcome everyone to Schmidtless Live, the first one. Yeah, it's going to be great now because I've got Grant here. So I'm Kurt Schmidt. I'm the president of Foundry. Today we're going to be talking about the sort of all the innovation that's been happening over the past few months, which we've seen so much transformation over the past few months in organizations. And I wanted to talk to Grant specifically about how that innovation is working. So Grant, thanks for joining me. How are you?
I'm doing good, doing really good. Thanks for having me. I feel honored to be on the inaugural run of the live video broadcast.
Yeah, well, here
I
you
thought our
are.
agreement was that we were both faces made for radio, so this
Yeah.
seems a little odd. I don't know.
Well, why not? I mean, all the cool kids are doing it, right, Grant? So why not us?
That's right. Yeah.
So I wanted to jump right in. So, we've seen so much innovation happen from all these different organizations over the past few months. Things that were taking people. I mean, I know for a fact that some organizations, some big box retailers, rolled out curbside pickup in weeks.
Yeah.
Where it was just taking them years before to figure out how to even do something that is seemingly simple. I know it's not simple, but as seemingly simple as allowing people to pull up and get their packages delivered to them or their goods delivered to them. So has bureaucracy just evaporated in COVID? Did COVID kill bureaucracy in these organizations, Grant, or
Yeah.
what's been happening?
Yeah, that's like the magic question, right? Because why couldn't you do this before? And I think there's a couple of key things, right? So like we know for sure like that some of the greatest innovations in history all came from constraints, right? You're constrained in some way, and therefore you had to do something. What we talk about a lot is I talked about people about like this is great, but like what are you pushing off against? You need something to push off against in order to go faster. And there's different ways of doing that or thinking about that. But in this case, we had a lot to push off against. The other thing that is sort of like inherent is like there's a common problem that's really well understood. And so when someone starts saying like, yeah, I hear that as a solution, like let's go do it, there's just a mandate. Everyone got what the problem was. They don't need to understand why that solution versus maybe another one, or maybe they don't care because they know that they need to move fast and that they can do whatever they need to do to go do it. And then the other part of it, which I think is maybe even more important, is in order to do a lot of the things we've seen companies do in a really short period of time, they used things that I think in most cases already existed. So in order to do that, so like it gets really the heart of it, right? Like why didn't you do it before? If it already existed, why didn't you do it before?
Right.
And
Exactly.
it's because the thing we're pushing off against, I think, give us a mandate where a couple things can happen. One, there's a mindset that says now we're doing this because we have to. But also, there was something that came along with that within an organization and within a bureaucracy, as you're pointing out, like that says because now you're allowed to, right? And the you're allowed to allowed people to play. It was okay to fall on your face. It was okay to suggest something that wasn't perfect. It's okay to take something that's half-baked or not right or whatever, right? Because everybody involved, from the customer through a supplier or a partner or your employees or your leadership, everybody understands sort of a common shared thing. And it's a really interesting sort of case around what makes good innovation work in general, right? Like everyone has to have a good shared understanding. If you can't tell a story that everyone understands, then how is anybody going to lean in and either become your customer or become a partner or sign off on something you're going to do? So I think those are the ingredients, right? Like you had to do it, but we had a shared understanding and there was a mandate to go and play. And that allowed us to say yes to things that may have come from parts of the company that were marginalized before, or maybe were voices that aren't normally heard, or suggestions or vendors. I'm going to use this vendor here because I can get it done tomorrow, right? Like how many pieces of technology have been adopted in the last few months simply because I could get the one little pain solved like now, and so therefore we just said yes because we can. And then like what opportunities come out of that for all those those platforms. And I think there's some interesting downstream consequences to actually that happening, where there may be some negative side effects of choosing certain things because they were convenient versus thinking a little bit more around like why one versus another. So like video conferencing is a great example of that, where everybody had to go remote.
Right.
But we didn't invent video conferencing because of the pandemic. We didn't invent remote work because of the pandemic. We didn't, nothing about remote work is new. In fact, all of it is really, really well understood. I've been doing remote work in one form or another for 20 years. It's just now some of the tools are a little fancier and require a little more CPU horsepower and nicer cameras and things. So choosing something just to say we're going to go do video conferencing is great. But now look at the changing expectation that people have. The starting out point was like, oh, it's okay if you're poorly lit and it's you don't have a background and you're in your basement and your kids are, climbing on you, and like that's okay. But through time, those things are going to go away as we start to expect both the employees that we work with to be more professional again, but also maybe, like the companies that we're getting services from to be more professional again. And I think that it sets some weird expectations. Like if you are used to working remote, how frustrated are you now when you, call an insurance company or call a bank and they can't just have a face-to-face conversation with you the way you do all day long at work, right? That's a whole new setting of expectation. And if that bank or that insurance company chose a video conferencing solution for their own employees that's not also a flexible platform that could maybe also be used to talk with customers, or now is a headache because customers have to adopt some weird licensing agreement or they can't install it because it's a work laptop, right? Like there's all these downstream consequences to like, we chose the thing that we could get up and running right away. We rolled it out really, really fast. And now we've trained ourselves on something that's going to be hard to change away from, but maybe we're stuck. And now we're not going to be able to meet future customer expectations. So, it's really interesting. Like
it is. Well, it's funny. I had an electrician out just a week or two ago, and I asked, "Oh, have you been busy lately?" And they said, "Yeah, a lot of people rerouting home offices, getting Ethernet plugged in through old phone lines, or like you're saying, like they're upping their game internally." And I could see, to your point, it trickling down even to like how new houses are built, or even to your point, the Comcast or something, where when you call them, you should be able to see somebody on the other side to talk with them, right? But these are all big giant changes that have happened in such a short amount of time. It's just, is it that cultural like sort of shift that's really pushed this? Because to your point, like, I get it. Like a lot of these places had a lot of these processes and things. A lot of people were moving towards an agile sort of approach with things. But it really seems like that cultural sort of movement of people all moving home and working the way you were just describing has really pushed this thing in a whole different direction that nobody could have. I mean, sitting there in January, you kind of thought 2020, just another one of those years.
Here's one of the really fun things to like think about for those of us of a certain age. How long have we been hearing about the paperless office? Like I remember entire ad campaigns run by companies like AT&T decades ago about like, the office of the future is paperless. There will be no paper. But isn't it odd that maybe it's the pandemic of 2020 that finally gets paper out of the office? Like the number of companies that I know that have entirely paper-driven processes around some parts of what they do, and then they can't. Like it's not possible for them to function, even though they can be doing their business. And so they suddenly had to go like, oh yeah, okay, that document scanning workflow thing, like wait, why are we scanning? Let's just make it all forms and like digital, and like the lawyers are like, yeah, you've been able to do digital signatures forever. Like, well, why did we have people sign these? It's like, because you didn't want to make the decision to be first. It's like, well, all of those reasons now are sort of falling away, and so it's like, yeah, this is just way better. Like, why do we have paper?
I just find it, like I said, I find it so interesting that because of the thing, like people were just like, oh, okay, like all the arguments and all the fights and things that were happening before have just disappeared.
I think the number one thing, so there's a couple of companies I'm talking with right now, and the resistance to suggestions of automating things have vanished. Like if I come in and I say, well, here we have this process over here, and we have to have all these people involved, but if we spend a little effort on this, we can connect these things, and we can remove all the manual work completely,
sure,
so that everyone will just be notified as things happen, and things will end up in the right place, or whatever the thing is. And the answer right now is just yes. And I've been really thinking a lot about like, well, why is it such a quick yes? Where before I'm quite sure it would not have been. There would have been a committee and hearings and like the whole thing. But there's sort of I think once everybody sort of understands remote, it's like, yeah, first off, how do I not have to be remote? How do I not have to sit in front of the camera all day long? Like, I think that on its own might be an interesting motivator to look into. But the desire then to get all of these things glued together to remove the other stuff that you have to do, I think it's a lot more clear than like the value of the tools, the value of like the machinery that we have. And like I've been having a lot of conversations around helping organizations understand, what's going to make you exceptional is to really embrace being a tool building culture. And you should look at these things not as a thing that dictates how you work, but as something that you will shape to accomplish the task you're trying to achieve. Go create a tool. And in the framework of automation, then automating how you connect tools together and things, it's sort of interesting, like how parts of organizations that had never thought that way are totally on board with it. And I don't know, maybe it's if you just sit in your house long enough, you have time to like think about things differently.
Maybe
by yourself.
But again, it's maybe you're finally going back through those cold emails you've gotten where people are saying we can help automate your business, and you're like, whatever, I got to get back to work, and now you're like, wait, where's that guy that had the
spam folder is way more interesting all this time.
Yeah,
if only I had some like group of companies that could help me make explainer videos,
Right. Yeah. Who's that? They contacted me like a year ago. I wonder if they're still around and they still do that. But that's the thing is like I see a lot more people kind of exploring those sides of things because we're talking about everything from manufacturing to marketing, right? So the person sitting there that has to make these decisions, right? I mean, they're looking at it and they're thinking, well, I mean, there's 35 million people out of work now or something, and they don't want to be added to that list, I'm guessing. So
right.
what's the risk of trying some new things now too, right?
Yeah, I think the barrier, there's a window, and I do think it is closing, and it's going to close faster in some areas than others. But I think there's an appetite for risk. Like early in March, there was probably an appetite for suggesting nearly anything in terms of how we're going to collaborate. How do we get people connected? Yeah. I think that has tamped down a little bit. So a really good like how do we go do it sort of conversations around schools. So I know my own kids. Like I knew they used iPads at school, and I know they do some code camp stuff, and they're still quite young, but they're fairly digital, and they have a school district that's St. Paul Public Schools, and they have some really great programs. I was shocked at how quickly they put together stuff, with a teacher strike, and then the pandemic started, and like it was just like a cascading of like the worst way
Right.
to have to go through all this stuff. But in the end, they basically got a curriculum up and running on the iPads. And it's interesting because it sort of worked in spite of the apps that were on the iPad. Like the apps on the iPad are just true garbage.
It's
like
garbage.
It's just the worst things I've ever seen. Like I can't even understand how they thought, whoever made it, like anyway, I'm not going to point out specific apps, but there's just a few that are just head scratch. Like, how did this user interface get made? Like, it was definitely not made for a teacher, and it was absolutely not made for a student. So, like, who was the target on this? And I think the answer to the question was a lot of things were chosen in there because of the administration features of it.
Right.
Because it could be remotely deployed, remotely managed, remotely paid for, remotely,
There's a process. The process around it was easier than the actual implementation or, execution.
Yeah, exactly. And it was, and the purchase then was given no criteria to choose from that had to do with like what the actual purpose of the software was, right? So the choice was to serve the bureaucracy. And I think that same decision making happened like within companies. So while all companies had the opportunity where there's a grace period where you could make the wrong choice, not all companies were brave enough to try something new.
Yeah.
And I think the ones that really listened to sort of the people closest to the metal, right? Like the nerds, or the people who are really specific on a set of tools and could recommend something that like, hey, this will do XYZ for us. I think those companies are going to show up looking really well. And I think they're also going to be really well positioned to flip those tools around again, like I was saying earlier, and make them be a tool that works for the revenue side of the business and not just the operations side of their business.
Well, and it's transformative, right? Because like you're saying, that operations side, if you look at like Starbucks, for example, versus a school, right? So Starbucks is closing 500 stores now because, and these were stores that were profitable. They weren't because they weren't making any money. It's because they're refocusing everything towards this new sort of reality. And I mean, their app experience is fantastic. It's great. And but it's so funny because
which, by the way, again, like that's pre-existing. So
right.
Like Starbucks is quite aggressive on user experience experiments and user experience development and so they're a company really well positioned to respond to a very changing in-store experience, meaning like no in-store experience, right?
Well, but that's the thing is like, and that's where, again, you look at them, just the balance that people have alone on their Starbucks apps, it makes them the 7th largest bank in the United States.
Right. Yeah.
So you talk about making a good call when it comes to innovating on your technology. You've become one of the largest banks in the country. But yeah, with that, then that's where I like where you're going here, because again, I think it becomes about that experiential side of things, not just for retail, but I think even for these other, and you and I have talked about this in the past, that these more mid-sized companies, these companies under 1,000 employees, their competitors aren't necessarily their direct competition. It's the experience that you have on Instagram or with Capital One or with other things. They're looking at your manufacturing place or your place that makes electronics equipment. They're expecting a similar experience, right? And now is the time where you have to double down on that.
For sure. I a number of years ago, I was executive director part-time of a nonprofit that mentored high school age filmmaking. And the kids would make these amazing films, and we'd have screenings, and parents and friends and teachers and people would all come to these screenings. And one of the things that I would always talk to the crowd about was there's no such thing as minor league filmmaking. When you go to a minor league baseball game or a high school basketball game, they're not professional, but everyone on the court is operating at the same level.
Yeah.
To a certain degree, right? But in film, the audience doesn't have a context switch where they're like, well, I'll just flip the switch and I'll forget that I've seen The Godfather, and I'll forget that I've seen Star Wars, and I'll forget that I've seen whatever my favorite movie or genre is, right? And I will watch this with clean eyes, appreciating the fact that this is a first-time filmmaker for the very first time trying to pull a narrative story together, right? Mm-hmm. And we would explain that to people, and there's sort of this moment, and then they would see the films and they would actually like be sort of blown away. But that understanding is really, really key to companies realizing that what they're going through, all of their customers are going through, and everybody who raises the game is now setting a new bar for them. And so, just like you're saying, the Starbucks app is now going to be the reason that everybody is like, well, how come those guys can't do that? How come Wendy's can't do it? How come Arby's can't do it? But more importantly, like, how come Mavericks, over near Rosedale can't do it? And
right.
Well, it's because they don't have a 300-person strong development team. That's true. That's why.
Yep.
And so that's where there's then opportunities, right? That's where there's opportunities for people to say, like, well, what are they doing? What are they doing? Okay, there's X number of million companies around the same size that maybe need the same thing, or even if it's tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, that's a really sizable market to go build a platform to go do interesting things on. Another one that's really interesting around that user experience thing is I know a lot of people who are doing, and I'm doing them, like things like this, but also, events have really moved online, and there's some really interesting challenges in running conferences online. Yeah. And I've seen a number of conferences do a lot of different things. So some actually will run multiple video conferencing platforms at the same time as a simpler way of moving people into like breakout or birds of a feather conversations. It's sort of like, if you want to join this one, go join this Zoom meeting. If you want to do this one, join this. But they've started off the whole thing in WebEx, and it's like, and then it's like, when you're done, come back to the WebEx and we'll do it. And it's a really interesting thing, because if you look at all the platforms that are out there, so you've got the Microsoft different platforms like Skype here, or you've got Teams, and then you've got like the WebExes of the world, and you got IBM and Cisco and Microsoft, and all these things are really designed to keep you on their platform. That's like sort of their thing. Like, we don't want you to be using vendors other than us for any of these things, so we'll give you some collaboration tools. But then you have guys out there on the other end, like Zoom, that are really building a platform, and they were really early to like allow people to integrate with them, and they've built an interesting ecosystem around them, and they have a conference on how do you integrate with this thing, and then there's guys in the middle that are sort of like Google, where it's like, we have a platform, but we still manage it as a federated thing, and yes, we're trying to lock you in, but you can also do some sort of interesting integrations. Okay, so if that's the backdrop, now you have needs for both individuals and groups to be able to provide experiences similar to an in-person experience, right? So on a conference, you have one thing where you maybe have several hundred or maybe even 1,000 if it's virtual coming into a conference, and then it's like, you have breakout sessions and you want to bring people back. Which of these platforms allows you to take a live video session and then move some of the people into another live video session and then bring them back and do it all seamlessly, right? And then which of those platforms would allow me to do that same thing if I am a local bank co-op, or if I'm a local retailer and I want to have consult on selling bathroom tile, or if I want to, what's the difference between those? In terms of a platform, it's the same exact mechanic. You're scaling up the number of people viewing at any given time, but that's sort of what the platform does. But that handoff is really interesting, and I actually think that there's going to be a huge amount of value provided to companies that chose to go with video solutions that were like platforms, right, where they could start looking at it and going, well, here's the features that I would like. I'd like to be able to have someone come onto my website and let's ditch this bot that everybody hates, and let's have a way where they could just bring up a greeter as if they walked into my bank, who might have 5 people that they're standing looking at, and they've got them in a queue or something, just like it's a group chat, but they just see me, and I'm like, hi, welcome to the bank, and other people can see me, welcome to the bank. I mean, I don't know, maybe that's a bad user experience, but but I can click and say, oh, here, Janet, the bank president's ready to meet with you. Here, boop, and I move you into that meeting, right?
Right.
And the experience of doing that feels very much the opposite of the experience of, say, calling your cable company to ask a question about your bill. Like it feels
right.
very personal, and it feels very like a high value. And we already know that if I can have a face-to-face conversation with you in person, the amount of information I can convey in a really short period of time is absolutely astronomical relative to what I can send in a tweet, relative to what I can send in an email, relative to what I can do on a phone call, relative to then what I can do in a video conferencing situation. So if you really want to maximize sort of those user experiences, I'm looking for the people next who are going to see everything that we're doing, and they're going to try and build us new ways of creating person-to-person experiences that don't have all the baggage of, pandemic outbreak infections, and also allow people to work at home or work remote and work 24 hours a day and, do all sorts of other interesting things. And right now, I don't know of a platform that lets me do that. But if I look at the landscape, I can tell you there's a few players I think are way better positioned to go do that than others.
Yeah.
And, who knows? So that's where some of those early willingness to play kind of things, decisions, may have set people on a new track that is going to either allow them or not allow them to think a little bit differently about how they do things.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really smart, Grant. It's changed some things in such a way that we haven't expected. And, you look at Amazon, for example, right? Would you say Amazon is too big to fail now? It's one of those companies. I mean, we're too reliant on it now to that supply chain to make everything happen, right?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I don't know if Amazon is beloved by policymakers enough to be too big to fail, right? Like they don't sort of have that extortion thing with like the Federal Reserve on their side, or
I suppose.
Where like there's no former Amazon executive running the Treasury who's kind of in there going like, I should really go save my friends over here.
Not yet, Grant. Not yet.
Not yet. No, you're right. Not yet. But but the other thing is, like if Amazon were to fail, like you can make a really long list of people who would want to buy parts of the skeleton. Like,
well, sure.
Like,
I mean,
logistics engine that they've built is a huge thing. Their hosting thing, they could be broken up pretty easily, I think.
Well, and a lot of people have called for that stuff. With a lot of these different organizations.
Yeah.
So final thoughts, Grant. What are we going to see here in the future? Like you kind of pulled out your crystal ball a little bit to talk about, let's say the future of maybe customer service and, call centers and things like that. But what do you see coming in the next few months? Because when I look at the news or things like that, and they're talking about opening up the country, I see people running to restaurants, not to offices. I see people running to sporting events, not
commercial real estate. Commercial real estate is the opportunity is to figure out what to go do with all that empty commercial real estate.
Co-working spaces?
Yeah, right. I know, right? I think it's all going to be turned into like private studios, actually, where you are basically going to be given fast video conferencing infrastructure and the ability to bring in a green screen and, who knows? I do think one of the things that may correct, I mean, real estate prices have felt high for a really long time. My favorite politician in the last however many decades is the guy, in New York who ran on the platform of the rent's too damn high.
Oh yeah, that guy's great.
Yeah, and he's not wrong, and it's worse in some areas than others, of course. But if commercial real estate really takes as big a hit as I think a lot of people are sort of expecting, what's really interesting is that our notions of shared spaces like restaurants may fundamentally shift where if the space gets cheaper that they used to occupy that was very expensive, maybe it allows the idea of a small restaurant to shift in some interesting way where it's actually physically large, right? So people are spaced out, and yet still operating as if it's a small chef-run, restaurant or a small
Sure.
little hole-in-the-wall place or something like that. That's sort of one thing that's, I think, kind of interesting. The other thing I'm surprised we haven't seen a lot yet is in the commercial infrastructure space around like commercial HVAC. There is a lot of existing technology from numerous vendors that is really well suited towards going into commercial properties, office spaces in particular, and basically allowing the air to be sterilized, through UV filtration systems in a more aggressive way than we've done before, where it's not just around comfort, but it's also maybe now around safety. And I'm surprised I haven't seen, and it can be just that I'm not specifically looking into the trades around people out selling this thing, but I can see as commercial real estate sort of takes a hit, they're becoming a real selling point from people who would like you to come to their building either to work or to do business around, well, this is a class 10 sterile environment or something, right?
Yeah.
And building some real standards around air quality beyond just how much pollen are we removing and how many chemicals are in the air and things like that. So I think that's sort of an interesting one to watch. I think the other really interesting thing in the next 6 to 8 months is going to be, I think there's going to be a really big discussion around what school is actually worth. Because at all different levels now, we've sort of said, okay, what was the value of school for, say, the K through 8 age range? Well, a lot of the value, it turns out, may be that the kids aren't in the house so that mom and dad can work or have the ability to go to work. And we sort of have now a better understanding of parents that in any given school day, those young kids are maybe doing an hour and a half to 2 hours of actual learning. And a lot of the other stuff is socializing. And I think a lot of us as parents realize now, wow, when your kids can't play with the other kids on the street or play with their friends or with their cousins or whatever for a period of time, like that's a really devastating deal. And it turns out like school really provides a necessary human function for that. So there's one set of values. And then on the higher education side of the world, I think you're already seeing a lot of discussion around like, explain to me why we have these big buildings. Like, why do we go to this thing? Like, what is it? It's very different if you're out doing a lab, right? If you're doing environmental studies, you need to be out in a bog taking water samples or something.
Sure.
Or if you are doing physics experiments or you need access to, particular equipment. Like that's very place oriented. But the majority of learning that goes on is stuff that can happen not at a college or university. And so if you sort of remove the trappings of all the buildings and all the things and whatever, it's like, well, what is this actually worth?
Right.
And then you start distilling it down and going like, and why does that one cost this much and why does that one cost this much? And it's a discussion that isn't just going to start now. I think this is maybe closer to the end of the discussion. We started this maybe a decade ago. Or maybe
when
a little
you
bit
say
less.
end of the discussion, do you mean like into decision-making mode? Is that what you mean?
I think it's the end of a current discussion, which is is there a difference in value between a pedigreed brick and mortar university with a long history and an online learning program that can teach you practical skills you can go and use today? And I do think that discussion's been happening for a little while now, and I think that we're getting near the end of that discussion where the universities that used to be where you had to go and sit in a big lecture hall and whatever have just proven what the online guys have been saying for a really long time. And so now we get to have the rest of that conversation, which was, and why does it cost so much? Like, is it because the value of the degree I'm getting, because that's what you've been selling me in order to get me to take out student loans, or is it actually something else?
Yeah.
So
a lot of these bigger schools are luxury brands now, more so than they are.
Yeah.
It's
a branding thing, lifestyle.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, Grant, I don't want to take up any more of your time. I mean, I was hoping we could fill up 15 minutes, but here we are at over 30, of course.
Yeah.
You and I could go on forever. Real quick before we sign off, do you want to talk a little bit about Knotion Labs and what Knotion Labs does, just so our audience knows?
Sure. So Knotion Labs is growth and innovation practice, and we say that we are twice as good at building the breakthrough products and services that are going to be the backbone of your company and the company that you want to run 5, 10, or 20 years from now. So you can find out more about us at notionlabs.com, which is KNOTIONLABS.com. And I'm Grant Wood, and you can find me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, Grant, I want to thank you so much for joining me. I'm
Yeah,
going to sign
sure.
off here real quick. Thanks, everybody, for watching the live stream. Next time, we're going to be talking a lot about about innovation. We're also going to be jumping into discussions around career progression for people who are interested in either upping their game at their current job or for people who are looking for work. I've got a few episodes I'm going to be recording soon to talk specifically about how to improve not only your resume, but also your LinkedIn presence, and then how to use LinkedIn most effectively to kind of grow and build in your career. So share the channel with folks. Going to start doing more of these. I hope it's a good idea. We'll see. But I'm so excited for Grant to join me, and I know he'll be back for more because him and me can fill up a lot of time. So thanks, everybody, for joining. We'll talk again at you soon. Bye.